For you. We are recording. Welcome. We're going to give it just a minute here as folks come in from the waiting room. But in the meantime, welcome you to put your name, where you're calling in from, and anything you want us to know about your work in the chat. Okay, Megan, how is the waiting room situation?
We are all in. We don't have
Excellent.
anyone waiting.
All right. Well, good afternoon or good morning, everyone. My name is Rachel Jacobson. I use she, her pronouns. I'm calling in today from Ann Arbor, Michigan, which is the lands of the Anishinaabe and the Wyandot peoples. And I am honored to be a member of the Policy Practice Group leadership team. I serve as lead researcher for state climate policy at Center on Budget and Policy Priorities. And I'm just going to open and close our meeting today, but really excited to have Melissa Hoffer, Massachusetts Climate Chief, coming to speak with us. And you'll hear more from her and Joel Smith later on in the meeting. But first, we just have a couple of updates from ASAP that we want to make you aware of. So next week, we have two peer learning groups for ASAP members. We have our Reconnect group and our private sector adaptation professionals group. And then we also have an opportunity for folks to sign up to be technical assistance providers as part of ASAP's collaboration with Institute for Sustainable Communities on EPA Environmental Justice Thriving Communities Technical Assistance Centers, or TICTACs. And Megan is going to put the links to those peer learning groups as well as the TikTok opportunity in the chat. And then Angelina is the point of contact for these opportunities. So we'll put Angelina's email in the chat as well. But with that, again, want to encourage folks to introduce themselves in the chat. Let us know who you are, where you're calling in from, anything important for us to be aware of about your work. And I am going to turn it over to Joel Smith to introduce our speaker.
All right, thank you, Rachel. So I'm Joel Smith, a semi-retired consultant and researcher in Boulder, Colorado, and it's my pleasure to introduce our speaker. So on her first full day of her administration, Massachusetts Governor Maura Healey signed an executive order establishing a position of climate chief and creating an Office of Climate Innovation and Resilience within the governor's office. Well, we're pleased to have Melissa Hoffer, who is Massachusetts' first ever climate chief, will speaking with us in a minute. Before taking on that position, Melissa was in the Biden administration, where she served as acting general counsel and principal deputy general counsel at the Environmental Protection Agency. Now, prior to that, she had worked for the state of Massachusetts, also the Conservation Law Foundation, and in private practice. But one thing that I really like about Melissa is that she lives in a farm in the beautiful central Massachusetts town of Barre, and where she raises a herd of Nigerian dwarf dairy goats. So maybe if we have time, we'll hear about those. But I'm going to post Melissa's bio and more information about our office in the chat. So Melissa, the floor is yours. Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you so much. I'm really excited to be here today, and I'm particularly excited to speak with this group. I'm happy to look out, and I haven't had a chance to go through all the names, but I see John Boldock is here. John used to ride my train back and forth into Boston every day and is an incredible leader in the climate space. And I see folks around from Horsley Witten, and I remember Scott Horsley teaching me my wetlands delineation class when I was doing my professional certification in environmental management at Tufts. So it's just great to see this group and everything that I know you guys are bringing to this moment. So I thought I would do a couple of things today with our time, and I'm just going to set my time because I could talk about resilience all day. I'm going to do a little bit of context setting for us. I thought I would share a little bit about the Vatican trip that the governor and I and our staff took earlier this year, because it was very much focused on resilience. And then I want to tell you a little bit about how we are approaching climate in the Healy administration. And then specifically, we'll get into some of the what's. What are we doing around resilience? So this is really an important conversation to me and probably to all of us. We find ourselves now, because we have lost so much time on mitigation. We're very far behind collectively, not just the state of Massachusetts, but collectively and globally, we're very far behind on where we need to be on emissions reductions. So you all are probably following the science like I do every day, and it seems like every day, I know just this week, another study came out showing how perilously close we are to seeing AMOC shut down and other really extreme tipping points. There is a heat wave in the Antarctic right now, and on and on. So where we find ourselves is in a position where we have to really sharply pivot away from fossil fuels as quickly as possible. And now we have to do that simultaneously while we're making both the built environment and our communities more resilient to the impacts of climate change. So one of the folks who is a member of the Pontifical Academies of Sciences and was instrumental in organizing the Vatican trip is the esteemed climate scientist Ram Ramanathan. Some of you may know who he is. And Ram's been around for a long time, long-standing climate scientist, just about 50 years, was one of the first people to understand what was happening with the ozone layer, was one of the first people to model and contribute to the early models of greenhouse gas emissions. And in fact, helped develop the technology that actually went up into the atmosphere and took samples to confirm the accuracy of the models. So it's been around for a long time, and you've probably seen him and others very publicly in the LA Times and other places taking the view that 1.5 is no longer attainable. And so, if you look at the data, we had about half of the days last year were more than 1.5 degrees centigrade. And you guys know that's about 2.7 degrees Fahrenheit. And just early this year, the EU Copernicus Climate Change Service said that global warming has exceeded 1.5 degrees over a 12 consecutive month period. So that's the first time that's happened since humans have been on the Earth. So it's looking more and more likely that we're going to overshoot 2 degrees. There's lots of ways we can come back from that, but that is a policy target, right? 1.5 and 2 were policy targets of the Paris Agreement. And so if you think about it, they're not safe. Like, we are looking around and seeing what is happening now, where we're just really getting to 1.5, and we're seeing catastrophic impacts all around the globe. So as I mentioned, Governor Healy and I had the opportunity to attend this summit that was organized by the Pontifical Academies, and UMass Boston played a big role in getting everybody there. In May, and the theme of it was really focused on governing in the time of climate change. So the attendees were folks in government. So there were many governors, mayors, all from around the world. And we issued a planetary protocol. It's public. You can Google it and find it. But it was focused on this concept called MAST. And MAST stands for mitigation, adaptation, and social transformation. So what was really notable to me in all this is that there was an equal emphasis on each of those elements. I think, many of you have probably been practicing long enough where you remember, like, adaptation was kind of a dirty word, and everything was focused on getting emissions down. And people were very worried that if we, focused on adaptation, there wouldn't be enough focus and attention on mitigation. But because of where we are now, we really need to have a very significant focus on adaptation. So I thought that was very interesting and a different aspect of this particular convening. The social transformation part, I think, is really very new and very innovative. And what it does is it recognizes that the severe impacts of climate change, which many of us are already experiencing, and the energy transition itself, is already having, and it's going to continue to have, really significant and transformative impacts on societies. So when we think about adaptation, it's usually, and this is all good stuff, we all work on it. It's usually like, how are we going to preserve our salt marshes or our forests, or how are we going to be dealing with sea level rise? And we have to do all that. But now we really need to be thinking about, how are we going to help communities deal with what is happening to them? So I don't know if you guys were tuned to this, probably you were, but on the anniversary of the July 2023 floods in Vermont got hit really badly again. And if you have friends there or you have professional contacts there, you know that some of the people that had just really kind of got back on their feet again after that disaster last year got wiped out again. So these kind of, repeat disasters, repeat loss scenarios are very challenging for communities, and not just from a fiscal standpoint. These are the kinds of things that can really affect health and well-being and mental health, people's ability to hold their jobs, education for kids, all these things. So thinking about all of the aspects of social transformation that are coming are really important. And, I view this also as a way to help us kind of reweave some of our social fabric. I mean, maybe you have heard people talk about this. I certainly have, and I feel the same way. We soon will not have the option of really being so atomized anymore. We're going to kind of have to get to know our neighbors and have to work with our communities so that we can be more resilient and ready to respond to these things. So just a couple of things, thinking about the different kinds of impacts. I've been thinking a lot about the resilience of our food system here in Massachusetts and New England overall. Many of you might have seen that Nature published a study just this week saying that the world's on course for much earlier occurring decreased cereal crop production. I happened to be in Ireland last summer, so I've been particularly interested in tracking this, but they have a major potato shortage looming for this fall because they had such wet weather this past spring. And that follows on a very poor potato harvest last year. And that again was caused by an unusually wet autumn. And that made it hard to get the machines and the equipment out into the fields. So planting this year's potato crop was delayed in Ireland, but across all of Northern Europe because of bad weather. Another example that maybe folks are thinking about, insurance industry, I'll talk a bit more about this later, but it's already taking steps to stem its losses from climate-driven catastrophic weather events. And these are steps that are resulting in a couple different things that you can see happening. One, we know that premiums are going up across the country. We know that means higher costs for consumers. And we know that there's just been wholesale withdrawal of certain insurance companies from certain geographic locations, certain markets. So if you were watching in the spring, you know that Federal Reserve Chair Powell testified to Congress just this that the inflation is being so stubborn, in his view, in part because of increased insurance costs that are resulting from climate-driven damages. Many communities across the United States, as I was just discussing, have been hit repeatedly by similar climate impacts. And the simple fact really is that humans have not lived in a world that is this warm. Our hottest periods, Hadean, late Neoproterozoic, the Cretaceous hot, the PDM, these all occurred millions of years before humans were here. So, NOAA has said that the fact that these hot periods, these hot health periods have occurred on Earth have no bearing on whether modern human civilization can cope with the level of warming we are likely to face if we do not stop adding greenhouse gases to the atmosphere. So that is a direct quote from NOAA. And I think the big thing that I take away from all of this is that if you think about our climate, modern human civilization, it had permanent periods of agriculture and settlements for the first time. That's really a phenomenon that has occurred just over the past 10,000 years. And that period has been one of generally stable temperatures, generally pretty low, and relative climate stability. So the thing that we keep in mind, as professionals working in this space, is that relative stability is gone. It's over. And it's going to be over for a long time when you think about the atmospheric resonance time of carbon dioxide. So for adaptation professionals and others working in this space, we really have to be thinking about building the resilience of both communities and the built environment. And the most important thing is that we need to do that like right now. So one of the things I wanted to kind of just start with you all is, as we're talking and as I'm, connecting with you on Zoom, just really remember, why did you go into this profession? What was it that drew you to this particular work, and what was motivating you? Because if there's ever a time for us to dig deep and tell our truth and be frank with our clients and our professional colleagues, now is that time. And I'm going to talk a little bit about sort of the management aspects of this work too, because I think it kind of ties in to that point. So let me tell you a little bit about how we're trying to inject climate change into everything that we're doing. And then I promise I will come back and talk about some of the specifics on resilience. But the important thing I think that I'm seeing is the how. When you think about how governance works, so much of it is, what we try to do in government actually is make things as predictable as possible. So when we talk about things being institutionalized, like they're heavily institutionalized, there are laws, there are statutes, there are policies, there are siloed structures within institutions, and there are ways of doing things, and there are people who've been there for a long time, and there's territory and ownership and all these things. So part of what we're trying to do with this whole of government approach is shake that up a little bit. It's good trouble, right? We're trying to be disruptive in a constructive way. So that means putting some more administrative structures in place. So the first thing that the governor did when she came into office, her very first executive order, is the one that established the climate office and my role. And the way that we are, it's structured, the way that we are injecting climate change into all these secretariats is twofold. One, we also created these secretariat climate officers. So for every agency, for the 11 secretariats, Health and Human Services and Public Safety and all the rest, they have a person. And these were people who worked there. We wanted people who knew their agencies well and had some aptitude or some interest in climate change. So they're responsible for driving, the climate policy. Now, as a practical matter, at this point, 18 months in, there's a team of people in these agencies, and I work with many different people in all the multiple divisions of each secretariat, whether it's, public health or MEMA or whatever. But those are the folks that are really owning what we're doing on climate change, and those are kind of the go-to people. So that means that there's somebody senior in every secretariat whose responsibility is to think about climate change, both mitigation and resilience. So that's one thing that we did, and we had those in place very early on. We meet with all those folks very regularly. We do a lot of cross-teaming on issues, and I'm going to give you some specific examples of that. And we're really trying to encourage outside the box thinking, because if there's one attribute that managers and really frankly all of us need at this time, it's really imaginative capacity. Because if we just kind of like keep doing things in the same way that we've always done them, we can see exactly where that's going to lead us, and that's not good. We really need to be able to think about two things, I think. One is you have to be able to very seriously entertain the possibility of what happens if we don't reduce emissions. And that can be a very frightening picture, but you have to understand that reality, and that is where we are heading right now today. Then I think you have to start to think about what would the world look like if we really started to act consistent with what the climate science is telling us. What would be different? How would that be different? And so those are the things that have to be informing, and we have to give space for that creativity to emerge from whatever your organization is. For me, what I have found is sometimes people have lots of pent-up demand or pent-up ideas about things they wanted to do, and you just kind of have to create the space for them to do it. For example, when I came in, there were folks who reached out to me from our Office of Operational Services, and they had tons of ideas about how we could get greenhouse, decarbonize our supply chain effectively through our procurement practices. And they were just raring to go. And so what they really needed was for me to help create the space for that, make it good, make it authorized, talk with whatever secretariat we needed to talk to, and just let them run with it. And they are doing amazing, amazing work in this space. So giving that ability and encouraging people to really bring those ideas is going to be very important at this time. So that's another aspect of it. We created a climate cabinet. That's a cabinet of all of the secretariats that meet monthly with me. And we have that time to do a number of different things. We have learned a lot. We have brought in experts from a variety of disciplines. We have focused on financial risks. We have focused on mental and physical health impacts of climate change, how the private sector can lead on climate change. Our next meeting is going to be focused on climate migration. We have talked about sea level rise and resilience of our coasts. So, that just gives you some flavor, but you got to think these are people who are at the top of their game, right? They are the people who are experts in economic development, experts in finance, experts in education, they are not experts on climate change. So, and they not expected to be. So we have a lot of learning to do together about these issues. The last kind of, sort of big picture thing about how we're doing this is trying to de-silo expertise. Now, this is, there's always going to be a need for specialization. That's really important. And you all specialize. I've been a lawyer for 25 years. I've specialized. And we really need more generalists. We need people who understand the big picture and know what specialties need to be involved in particular projects. That is super, super important. It's something that climate change really demands because of how it touches on every aspect of everything that we do. So building the muscle for people to really build the relationships, hang out with each other, develop trust, work on projects together and bring that expertise. So that's kind of another attribute that we're really encouraging. So that gives you some sense of how we're bringing this whole of government approach to what we're doing. If you want to read more about this, you can read the recommendations that I gave to the governor last year. They're available online. You can just Google Healy recommendations of climate chief and you will get the whole document and you can take a peek at it if you haven't seen it yet, but we talk a little bit about our approach. So that's really important, give you a sense of how we're trying to do this. We're trying to do government in a very different way so that we can be ensuring that climate change is a part of the core mission of every secretariat in the executive branch. So that's how we're doing it. And then let me speak just a few minutes here about what we're doing, and then I'm happy to take your questions and we can get to stuff that I didn't get a chance to touch on. So one of the first things when I was doing these, the executive order also required me to provide recommendations to the governor right about at the 6-month mark. And so I did that. And one of the things that I noticed looking into this, Massachusetts is a state was at the forefront of climate legislation. It was 2008. We passed a Global Warming Solutions Act. We passed a Green Communities Act. We've had statutory obligation to reduce our emissions significantly on the books for a very long time, but we're not where we need to be. And when I say that, I don't mean to call Massachusetts out. Really, everybody is behind on where we need to be. Globally, the energy transition alone is going to cost, several $1 trillion, and everybody is behind on it. One of the key reasons we're behind on it is because we have never really figured out, and again, we're not alone in this compared to other states, we've never really figured out what is the level of investment that's required to get to net zero by 2050. And we've never really looked and thought about the level of investment for our key resilience needs. For certain things like dealing with sea level rise in Boston, for example, there are some numbers around that the city of Boston and others have come up with. But by and large, when we think about, okay, what would it really take for us to deal with inland flooding in central Massachusetts? What would it take for us to, really deal with sea level rise up and down the coast? We don't really know those costs. So what I recommended was, let's try to get our arms around that. Let's try to understand that, and not just those costs, but let's also think about the concrete funding and financing strategies that can help us meet those needs. They are statutory obligations for the emissions reduction. And let's also begin to monetize all the other benefits that are associated with them. So, for example, many of you probably saw this. I have been going back to this so many times. If you haven't seen it, you should check it out. Potsdam Institute came out with a study, I think in April, that was published in Nature. And they were estimating that even if all carbon dioxide emissions were basically ended today, and we're just looking at past emissions, the stuff that's already gone up into the air, the world economy is already committed to an income reduction of 19% by 2050, just because of the damages that are going to happen from those emissions. So their conclusion was, we're going to see massive economic damages over the next 25 years, including in highly developed nations. But the most important thing is that the cost of ongoing climate damages from past emissions is 6 times larger than the cost of the mitigation we need to limit global warming to 2 degrees C. I'm going to say it one more time because it's so important. The cost of ongoing climate damages from past emissions is 6 times larger than the cost of mitigation we need to limit global warming to 2 degrees C. So if you want to get a sense for that, is what they calculated is total damages from past emissions on the order of 38 trillion US dollars annually by 2050. So what does this tell you? Right, it tells you that it's a huge bargain to be investing as quickly as possible in getting our emissions down, getting off of fossil fuels. Like, we have all these fancy words, like we're going to decarbonize buildings and, electrify what it means is getting fossil fuels out. Fossil fuels out of the heating sector for buildings, fossil fuels out of the power generation sector, fossil fuels out of transportation. And it's with respect to natural and working lands, conserving and ensuring that our forests, our wetlands, our prime agricultural soils, like those things are protected and available to do the carbon drawdown that we need. Because you would see, if I had a chart for you, you would see that we never get to net zero without the work of our forests. That's what brings us down, and we don't get there without it. So super, super important. And, a word on that, and many of you guys are probably following this too. Another study came out recently. I think we have to be thinking about the damages avoided. So when we look at what is the level of investment to get to net zero, contextualize these numbers, right? It means we avoid much more expensive climate damages. So it's a bargain in that way. It means that we have health co-benefits, because the more we get off fossil fuels, the more we have fewer criteria pollutant emissions. And so, and I know you guys know this, but we save millions of lives and health costs by just getting away from the NOx and the SO2 and the particulate matter and so on. And we also have energy cost savings. So it's important to contextualize those numbers. They bring lots of co-benefits with them, and those are just some. And also, in this way of thinking about, what are the values that we get in doing these things, we have to start really thinking about the economic value of the ecosystem services that are yielded by natural and working lands. So the study that I was just referencing, this is another one, was looking at East Coast forests. So this is just the regrowth that has happened from deforestation during the colonial period, recently found to be cooling land surface by 1.8 to 3.6 degrees Fahrenheit annually. So you think about it that way, our forests are big, giant direct air capture. We don't have that yet, right? There's no technology that will suck carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere right now that's cost effective. So forests do it, and they do it for free. And now we know they're also big, giant air conditioners also doing it for free. So preserving that really looks like a bargain too. So starting to think differently about how we analyze these costs is important. So that was a recommendation. We sent RFPs out for both analyzing strategies to fund resilience and looking at level of investment to get to net zero and strategies for funding and financing that early this year. And both of those studies are underway right now, and AECOM is the contractor for those. Our Municipal Vulnerability Program, people on the call are probably very familiar with that. MVP is a much, much beloved program. We just put our MVP 2 out, which focuses much more on getting actual projects done. And also brings a much more focused EJ lens to that work. But just yesterday, I was in Leominster for the announcement of this year's MVP awards, and that was really wonderful. And there's terrific work being done with it. Leominster is not far from where I live, and they, were hit by terrible flooding last year, about 12 inches of rain one night, and I had gone to see Mayor Mazzarella not long after that happened, and he was telling us they're walking around in this flooded area, and they went to some building that had been flooded, and there was a desk in it. They opened the drawer. He said, "My God, there was a fish in it." Like the damage was just unbelievable. So they got an award through MVP, just to give you a sense of what it does, to do some nature-based solutions that will help restore some of their flood storage capacity. Other MVP awards will include design for some replacement of the water pump station out in Northampton, which almost failed last year during the flood events. It's also included things like Plymouth's a couple years ago was a study of the risk of salination coming into their sole source water supply as a result of sea level rise. So it does things like that, and it's great. You have probably heard about our Resilient Coast program. It's still under development, but what it's going to be doing is developing or putting into different districts, different sections of the Massachusetts coastline. And the idea is that we will then be able to have, sort of more regional resilience measures for these related towns and cities on our coast, so that we're not kind of going through and every town has its own plan, and we're trying really more to think of a regional approach so that we have resilience measures that are going to work. And obviously a part of that will include a more significant emphasis on voluntary retreat, managed retreat, where that makes sense, and we're starting to think about the right way to initiate those kinds of conversations with communities. So a couple other things I wanted to quickly touch base on. This year in her budget, the governor proposed a disaster response and resilience fund. Massachusetts, believe it or not, was one of only 2 states that does not have a disaster response and resilience fund. So very fortunately, in the budget that was signed just Monday, our fund is in there. It was capitalized at $14 million, which is less than what we asked for. But we're very grateful to see it in there, and we're going to keep working. We're going to build that number up. And the idea is that that fund will be there for communities when they experience a climate-driven weather event that is not going to be qualifying for federal FEMA funds. That is a real gap. If you're hit with something and it's not a FEMA declared disaster, there's really before, now there is, but before there really wasn't a source of state relief for you. So now there will be, and in order to be eligible for that funding, you will need to agree to build back to resilient building standards, and those are being developed now by EEA and by MEMA with Climate Office. So we're very excited about that. Administrator Criswell is coming to see us soon from FEMA. FEMA's been doing a bunch of work in this space, so we hope to benefit from their expertise in that areas. You may have seen our guidance come out recently on salt marshes, making it much easier to do the kinds of work that is necessary now to protect our salt marshes. Our salt marshes are under extreme threat from sea level rise, and so we are trying to make it easier now. DEP is trying to make it easier to get a permit to do some things that are basically emergency measures, if you will, runneling and thin layer placement and the like to help our salt marshes. We expect to be having some additional regulatory changes coming out related to wetlands as well, but that guidance came out, I think, in June. So you can see that also. Heat is something that we're very focused on right now. I can't tell you too much about it, but look for something hopefully on heat towards the end of September, taking that much more seriously. You may know that many states have come out recently, about 7 states dealing with specific executive orders or other measures on heat, and we think it's time to do that here. Forests, you probably saw our Forest as Climate Solutions work last year. We brought together a team of experts. These were forest ecologists, foresters, climate scientists who met over the course of several months and provided recommendations to Fish and Game, to DCR, to MWRA, all the folks that maintain state-owned forested land, for what we can do to do a better job to make our forests more resilient, to change some of our harvest policies, and so forth. So those recommendations are also available publicly. You can take a look at those. I was just actually out Monday in the mosquito-y rain. It was a great day. I went around with DCR to a bunch of its different sites to kind of see what they're doing to help make our forests more resilient. And you all know that we have a resilient mass plan. I think you are familiar with it, but I want to just kind of focus on it because it's really very cool. You have to have a plan for how you're going to deal with emergencies in order to be eligible for FEMA funding pursuant to the Stafford Act. During the Baker administration, they made the decision to combine that plan with our adaptation plan, and that's our Resilient Mass plan. So if you haven't looked at it, it's excellent. And we have a Resilient Mass action team internally in state government, and that is also across all secretariats. So that's where we bring people together to talk about resilience and to make sure that the agencies are doing what they need to do to make their own assets more resilient as well. And lastly, I just want to touch on insurance. This is a big topic right now. We, for the first time about 2 years ago, put out a survey where we began to ask for a disclosure from all of the insurance companies that do business in Massachusetts. And just as a super quick primer, the main role of our division of insurance is to make sure that our insurance companies are solvent, right? We want to make sure that they're healthy, they're able to pay on claims. That's kind of that job. But that job is changing because you really have to think about the sort of big risk to insurance companies now is climate change. And I'm sure you've all been reading the articles in the Times and otherwise. So we want to make sure that we're thinking about climate change very seriously in Massachusetts, because we are already seeing, at least hearing anecdotal reports of people's premiums going up and insurance no longer being available in certain circumstances after disasters occur. So thinking about how to address that, making sure our FAIR plan is going to be sufficient, because, obviously, when a big disaster happens and people don't have adequate insurance, some of those things were down to the state. And the state of Massachusetts, for example, self-insures. So for our own assets, we're on the hook for that. So the other thing to think about with resilience and insurance, and these are very nascent conversations, but I think they're interesting, so I wanted to share them with you, and I'm curious what people are hearing, is there a way that insurance industry can really pair with state government in helping to fund and finance resilience measures? Because if you think about it, they have an interest in reducing exposure to future claims, much the same way that we have an interest in reducing our future damages. So is there a way to, monetize the present benefit of, or monetize the future benefit of, avoided claims, so that it's worth, or there's a value stream that would be there to help fund resilience projects? There are some interesting examples. Alabama has a roof replacement program that has been wildly successful, and where the state just started essentially paying people to put better roofs on. And maybe you have seen some of these pictures, but they're pretty amazing. And you see a hurricane go through, the roofs that were replaced in this program look good. The ones that weren't are gone. And so that caught the attention of the insurance industry. The insurance industry now is helping to support that program in the form of reduced premiums and reduced deductibles. So we are diving into that, having lots of conversations, looking at things like parametric insurance to help provide additional insurance where we think people might be underinsured, and trying to come up with a strategy. So I share that by way of giving you a sense of, that's something that's brand new for all of us, really. And so we're trying to work in partnership with the insurance industry and with others who are thinking, innovatively in this space. So we don't have the answers on it yet, but we know it's something that we really have to think very carefully about. And with that, I think I'm going to turn it over to you guys for any questions that you have.
Well, thanks, Melissa. Wow. That was great. Appreciate it. Thank you so much. So
Yeah.
we have limited time for questions, and I'm going to suggest if you are not able to ask your question, please email Megan Putnam, who's with ASAP staff. And Megan, maybe if you can post your email in a chat, and if you don't mind, Melissa, we could pass them on to you or your staff and see if we can get some
Sure,
follow. Appreciate
Joel. Happy
that.
to do
Yeah.
that.
So let me just see if there are any questions. I see Rachel's hand up, so Rachel, go ahead.
Melissa, thank you so much. That was incredible, and one of the more inspiring talks that I've heard in a long time. I specifically support states across the country, and specifically thinking about building
adequate and sustainable state revenues to deal with adaptation, mitigation, and loss and damage. And I'm wondering if there's anything in the lessons learned from the whole of government approach and the administrative structures that you've put in place that strikes you as particularly bipartisan that could be transferred to other states that don't have necessarily the full support of an administration behind them.
Yeah, that's such a good question. And I'm going to answer it. This isn't about resilience, but I do think this movement, like most states do a bunch of grant programs, and we do lots of grant programs, and they're great. But with a grant program, you give the money away and then it's gone. So we're really trying to think about, like, how do we do more like banks? How do we do more things where we lend that money, even if it's concessionary, like we're going to get it back at some point. I think that has, and it had here, like pretty broad bipartisan support when we did the climate bank. And the community climate bank, you guys know, like that has very limited jurisdiction because it's just dealing with decarbonization of affordable housing. And so to be in conformance with Mass Housing's organic statute, like that's all they can really do. So community climate bank is doing that, and it's doing a lot with it. But the thing that's great about it is it's like a loan. So we're giving money out for people are doing this decarbonization, and then they are paying it back over time. I think that idea is something that has natural bipartisan appeal because it appeals to fiscal conservatives, because it's a better use of state funds, and it gets the work done that the climate people want to get done. And it also has appeal to the social justice folks because that's really a boon to disadvantaged communities also, and it provides all kinds of health needs. So I think so. And like, if you think about Connecticut's Green Bank, which has a much broader mandate, and this is where we want to go with our Green Bank ultimately, but they right now have a 7-to-1 leverage ratio. So for every dollar that Connecticut puts in, it attracts $7 worth of private investment to come in and help to finance something. So it's a way to get private sector funds off the sidelines too, because you can make, let's say we want to decarbonize, a bunch of low income housing, and there's like a perceived credit risk, and so like your typical banks aren't going to want to come in and do that. But we can say, we'll give you a loan loss reserve. So if you come in and help us loan, you don't have to worry about it. We'll promise you'll get paid back whatever it is, and we can do interest rate buy downs and things like that make it more comfortable to get your traditional banks co-financing those projects. So fingers crossed, our tranche of greenhouse gas reduction fund money will come in on top of that initial 50 million capitalization. But that's the first thing that popped in, Rachel.
Thanks so much.
All right. Take one more question from John Bolduc had his hand up first. Roderick, apologies, because then I'm going to turn to Rachel. Do you have questions in the chat, Rachel, that we can ask?
Yeah, we have a few
John?
questions that have come through.
So you might pick one. Unfortunately, we're not going to limited time, but John, go ahead. John Bolduc.
Yeah. Hi, Melissa. So thank you. As always, very inspiring. I can't think of anyone more perfect to be climate chief in Massachusetts. So the question I want to ask is, as you know, Massachusetts passed some pretty far-reaching, impactful climate legislation, but it has tended mostly to focus on mitigation, right? So I was wondering if you thought it's useful to have legislation or statutory requirements around adaptation to facilitate the work that we need to do. Like Kyle Johnson noted, some of the barriers municipalities face, in putting rules in place that conflict with the building code. So I can imagine legislation could help with that.
Thank you, John. It's so good to see you. Thanks so much. There's about 5 million things I want to say about the legislative process right now that I won't say.
Appreciate that.
It's hard. It's hard. So my answer is yes, that would absolutely help. And having our building codes reflect the resilient standards is necessary. And we need to be dealing with lower embodied carbon and a bunch of other things that way too. Having it in statute is best. That's the gold standard, because then, it survives from one administration to another. Like something like, the climate chief is an executive order that if another governor comes in and is like, I don't like that, then it's gone. So for the policy durability, The statute is the gold standard. And yes, that would help a lot because it's like everything else, John. I think we really want to be creating the market for these resilient building technologies. We want to have the same kind of shifts happen there that is happening slow but sure with the energy transition. You know, we do really have, especially with the IRA now, a piece of legislation. You know, we've got a lot of dollars coming into that space, and you're seeing a lot more activity there than we have in a long time. And that's providing the appropriate market signal. And we still need much, much, much stronger market signals. But to have that for resilience is going to be important too. What I am finding, and maybe you guys know resources, you know, to convince me otherwise, but resilience is just harder to finance. It's harder to finance because we know the clean energy space very well, and we understand, like, you do this, you're going to get this much operational savings in the future. And, you know, solar is like largely a capital investment. There's not that much operating costs, and then it's like free energy forever, pretty much. So that's easy. You know, we can come into a school district and enter into contract, and this is what places like Generate Capital do. And they go, okay, school district, we'll decarbonize everything, and you're going to pay us back over the next 20 years from the savings on your bill. That's not the way it is with resilience. So it's a tougher nut to crack. And a lot of super smart people who are not me are thinking about it. But that is what I'm worried the most about with resilience.
All right, thanks. So I'm going to turn it over to Rachel, and Rachel, I'll leave it up to you to both, you see if there are any questions in chat as well as wrapping up the meeting. But just want to say, Melissa, thank you. And as a kid who was born in Woburn and grew up in Williamstown, you make me proud of Massachusetts.
Thank you. This
So
was
thank you very
great.
much. So Rachel, all yours. And oh, one more thing. If you have questions for Melissa, please email Megan Putnam, mputnam@adaptpros.org. And then Megan, we can figure out how to get them to the questions to Melissa and her staff. All right. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Joel.
Rachel.
And thanks everybody for doing this work. It is vitally important.
So Melissa, I'll throw you one more question from the chat, and then there's you know, we've talked a lot about governance. We actually have a technical question that maybe you can answer swiftly, and we can squeeze in one more governance question. But I want to give this one some airtime. So this is about the Massachusetts Resilient Coast Initiative, and a question about whether it includes consideration of blue carbon and how that intersects with homes and upland efforts.
So that's a great question. I don't think the building standards do, but we do have a blue carbon initiative underway through Fish and Game. Yes, Tom O'Shea is heading it.
Great. All right. So let's turn back one more time to governance. And you know, you were talking a lot about how leaders within departments are, you know, and collaborating amongst and communicating amongst those leaders is an important part of this whole of government approach. Can you say a little bit more about how you're working to reinforce this sentiment amongst staffers within those departments as well? So just, you know, going up and down the ranks and really integrating this amongst the entire staff.
Yeah, so we're trying to work directly with as many of the staff as possible. Creating the opportunities for the staff to work together and basically staffing initiatives with multiple representatives of different agencies. So for example, on these economic analyses, that requires us to look at every secretariat that has a legal obligation for an emission reduction target under the Clean Energy and Climate Plan, which is the thing that the Global Warming Solutions Act requires. So those are our statutory requirements. So that means that all those staff from the different agencies are working on that stuff. So, you know, we work with all of them. And I think I will tell you this, this is true across the board, but it's particularly true with the younger generation. They are fired up to work on climate change. So having an opportunity for those staff to really like own this and have a part of it seems pretty exciting. So there's both the secretariat message that this is where we're heading, but then it's also the I always kid with people like I'm kind of an interloper, but you know, like I try to like get in there, and our teams try to work directly with the staff because it's great for them, you know. And I go around and I talk to their teams and I do presentations to them, and you know, we've had a couple get-togethers, with food and stuff for the SCOs and those teams. So you try to build some camaraderie that way, but also just to give them opportunities to work together so they get to know each other.
Awesome. I don't think we're going to need 7 minutes to wrap up. So if you're game for, 2 more questions, we've
Sure.
got some for you. Okay, excellent. What public sector experiences have you observed to get industries like insurance, banking, finance, consulting, planning that often intersect in the context of law and politics, aware and incentivized to implement resilience actions in the private sector in collaboration with government?
Sure. That's a wonderful question. And I'm going to talk at a very high level about this because we have been having some conversations and we have been keeping those Chatham House rules. But I will tell you, in my long time in the climate space, I have never seen the eagerness from the private sector that I'm seeing now. Like they totally get it. And I will say resilience is top of mind. And so there's a lot of creative thinking happening right now within private sector. They totally get that a state government is not going to be able to pay for it, and neither is the federal government. So there's a lot of thinking about how to come in and help with these investments. So I'm finding that very encouraging. And I don't know, I think in some places it's just the sea change, like people kind of see the physical reality of climate change, but whatever it is, I find that the tenor of the conversation is quite different than it has been, like 20 or 15 years ago. So I think there's real promise in that. It's not everybody, but people do really get it. And I do think that the IRA has also helped a lot because, that's got people focused on very concrete, direct pay is huge. And that's something that everybody can take advantage of. Direct pay are if you're not familiar with it, they are the tax credits. But even if you're a tax exempt entity, you're still eligible for them, and they're like up to 30%. You put solar in at your facility, you're going to get 30% back, and then you can reinvest that in heat pumps or something else. Like and they're basically like limitless. They're in place for a pretty long time, 10 years or something like that. And you can use them as extensively as you want. So there's a lot of, I say like an emerging understanding. So not where we need to be yet, but a really big change and moving in the right direction.
Awesome. And Josh, that was your question. So I just want to invite if you have any follow-up to that, and then we'll take Joel and we'll move into our closing.
No, that's a good enough answer. Thanks.
Awesome. Yeah, Joel.
You mentioned transformation as a key goal that coming out of the Vatican summit. And by the way, congratulations on that. But I wonder, transformation, we talk about changing location, changing livelihoods, changing the way people live. That can be threatening to people. I'm curious how you address that. And maybe if you want to talk about in the context of relocation, and I'm thinking not just from the coast, but also, since I grew up in the Berkshires, inland flooded areas. If the state is dealing with it, is it running into resistance, and how do you overcome that? Thanks.
Yeah, no, it's such a good question. So Joel, when I came into this role, I was curious if we'd ever done anything, on managed retreat. So I was just like asking a few questions, and I found that this was during the Baker administration, had set aside $40 million for voluntary relocation. And I think this came about. Remember when that storm came and it like really damaged a lot of buildings in Situate, and the governor, I think it might have happened sometime after that. Not one penny has ever been spent from that $40 million, at least by the time I got here. So it's a very hard conversation, and we're not having it. And I know that when I've gone out and I've talked to coastal communities, there is, in some of them, there's a real sense of how are we going to broach this with people, because there's a lot of resistance to the discussion. In other communities, there's not so much. But if you look at CZM's mapping, you can see, because it's if you haven't done this, you should definitely take a look at it. You can plug in different communities and then it will show you like 2030, here's where the ocean's going to be, and 2040, and so you can just see like stuff disappearing. And so one of the conversations we're having with Resilient Coasts is, should we just be hosting or working with communities to begin to have some of these conversations? And again, and John's heard me talk about this, but there's another great Nature article that came out. This was several years ago that somebody told me about and I read, and these were social scientists. And to deal with this problem, what they did was, and I think this was in the UK, they worked with communities to imagine what would have to happen in your coastal town to make you take the first step. So I'm just making this up, but for example, like maybe the road that goes to the grocery store and the bank and stuff, maybe that's flooding five days a year. And so at that point, you're going to relocate some of that infrastructure. And then the next thing maybe is, the ocean is coming up to where your firehouse is and your ambulance. And so at that point, you would move that, and so on and so forth, so that you're trying to think. The way I think about this in my mind, if it's helpful, if any of you have had aging parents, you kind of know there are certain milestones, right? Like there's going to be the time when maybe everybody's living on that first floor because stairs aren't doable anymore. And maybe there's a time when there's a conversation about driving, and then there might be a conversation about downside. Like it doesn't all happen like that. And so I think that's maybe one analogy, and there are probably better ones, to get people to understand, like you don't have to just move all at once, but you want to start thinking about the things that are going to happen so you have a plan for the community. And in this particular scenario in the study, it ends or it culminates with a barrier dune breaching, and the whole town, what remains of it is submerged. And at that point, the decision of what to do is left to the future generation. So I do think those ways are helpful because it helps communities themselves think. They know their town, they know what they need, they know what happens, and this is a way to maybe introduce the conversation. And obviously the state's never going to come in and tell people, community, what they need to do, but we can facilitate the conversations, and we can certainly help allay the cost for voluntary managed retreat.
Thank you so much, Melissa. And that is, a difficult but also very forward-looking note for us to end on. And I think you've really inspired all of us to, we're all people who think about the future all the time. We're adaptation professionals, but your remarks and your how-tos of how to do that in an inclusive and collaborative way using a whole government approach, I think are really inspiring. So thank you so much for being here. As we close, I just want to remind and encourage people that if you're interested in sharing an update, a policy update at a future meeting, you should connect with Anna McGinn, and Megan will put Anna's email in the chat. Our next meeting will be Friday, September 6th. And then we have a fairly active Slack channel that folks are invited to use. So we'll put the link to the Slack channel in the chat as well, so we can continue to communicate in between meetings. Thank you so much, Joel and Melissa and Megan, and we'll see you all next month.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody. This was a real pleasure.